The scream that tore through White Pine, Nevada on that scorching August morning in 1876 belonged to a woman who had just discovered her husband's body behind the mercantile. And that scream changed everything for Hannah Nichols, though she would not know it for several hours yet. Hannah stood behind the circulation desk of White Pine's only library, a modest building that had once been a saloon before the temperance movement convinced the previous owner to sell. The walls still smelled faintly of whiskey and tobacco, no matter how many times she scrubbed them with lye soap. She was arranging a shipment of books that had arrived from San Francisco the previous week, her slender fingers running across the leather spines with reverence. At 22 years old, she had been the town librarian for 3 years, ever since her voice had been damaged by scarlet fever when she was 19. Before the fever, Hannah had sung in the church choir with a voice that people said could make angels weep with envy. After the fever, her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, a breathy sound that required listeners to lean close and concentrate. Most people in White Pine had learned to read her lips more than hear her actual words. The library position had been offered out of pity by the town council, but Hannah had transformed it into something remarkable. She had written to universities and private collectors, begging for book donations. She had organized reading groups for children and adults alike. She had made the library a place of refuge and learning in a town that desperately needed both. The door opened, letting in a blast of heat and dust. Hannah looked up, her hand instinctively moving to her throat, a habit she had developed whenever someone new entered. She saw Sheriff Morrison's deputy, a young man named Thomas, his face flushed and anxious. "Miss Nichols," he said, then stopped, remembering he needed to let her speak first, or she would strain her voice trying to project. Hannah moved from behind the desk, her long gray skirt rustling against the wooden floor. She wore her dark brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes held a question. "There's been trouble," Thomas said, lowering his voice though they were alone. "Henry Morrison found dead behind Miller's Mercantile, shot twice. The sheriff wants everyone to stay indoors until we figure out what happened." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. Henry Morrison was the sheriff's younger brother, a gambler and drinker who had never caused serious trouble but had always seemed to be circling it. She whispered something, and Thomas leaned closer. "I am very sorry to hear that," Hannah repeated, her whisper barely audible even in the quiet library. "Sheriff wanted me to tell you direct because the library's on Main Street. Keep the doors locked. We don't know if this is random or if there's going to be more trouble." Thomas touched his hat brim and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Hannah locked the door and pulled the curtains halfway, leaving enough light to see but obscuring the view from outside. She returned to her desk and tried to focus on cataloging, but her hands trembled slightly. Violence was not unknown in White Pine, but murder was rare. The town had grown up around silver mining, and while it had its share of saloons and gambling halls, it had mostly avoided the worst excesses of some frontier towns. She was still working an hour later when she heard horses outside, many of them, moving fast down Main Street. She rose and peered through the gap in the curtains. A group of riders, maybe 15 or 20 men, were heading toward the sheriff's office. They looked like miners, still covered in dust from the diggings. Hannah felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. A mob was forming, probably demanding justice or revenge or both. The afternoon dragged on. Hannah tried to lose herself in her work, but she kept glancing at the clock. She lived in a small room behind the library, a convenience that had seemed practical but now felt isolating. She heated water for tea on her small stove and ate some bread and cheese, though she had little appetite. As evening approached, She heard another commotion outside. This time it sounded different, more organized. She looked out to see Sheriff Morrison addressing a crowd from the steps of his office. Even from a distance, she could see the grief carved into his weathered face. He was speaking, but she could not make out the words. The crowd dispersed slowly, and darkness fell over White Pine. Hannah lit the lamps in the library, their warm glow pushing back the shadows. She decided to stay up late, working on correspondence with a collector in Boston who had promised to send her a set of Shakespeare's works. Her whispered voice made verbal communication difficult, but her written words flowed clear and strong. She was sealing the letter with wax when she heard a knock at the back door, the one that led to her living quarters. Hannah froze. The back door was not visible from the street. Only someone who knew the library's layout would know it was there. The knock came again, soft but insistent. Hannah picked up the fireplace poker, her heart hammering. She moved quietly to the door. "Miss Nichols." The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas or maybe Oklahoma. "My name is Harrison James. I'm the new deputy. Sheriff Morrison sent me to check on you. There's been some developments." Hannah stood on the other side of the door, debating. She whispered, knowing he could not hear her, then cursed her damaged voice silently. She set down the poker and opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man on the other side was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a deputy's badge on his leather vest, and a revolver sat holstered at his hip. His face was lean and weathered, marked by sun and wind. There was something about him that suggested competence, a quality of being fully present in the moment. "I apologize for the late hour and the back door, madam," Harrison said, his voice low and respectful. The sheriff thought it would be less conspicuous. "We've had some threats made tonight, and some of them mentioned the library. Fellow who made them said something about burning down places where people put on airs. Sheriff Morrison takes that seriously." Hannah's eyes widened. She fumbled with the chain and opened the door wider, gesturing for him to enter. Harrison stepped inside, removing his hat. He was even taller than she had first thought, and his presence seemed to fill her small living space. She whispered something, and confusion crossed his face. Hannah felt the familiar frustration rise in her chest. She pointed to her throat and shook her head, then gestured for him to wait. She moved to her writing desk and quickly wrote on a piece of paper. "My voice was damaged by scarlet fever. I can only whisper. What threats?" Harrison took the paper and read it, his expression softening with understanding. When he spoke again, he moved closer and lowered his voice, as if matching her whisper with his own quiet tone. "Some miners got liquored up after hearing about Henry Morrison. They've got it in their heads that someone from back east killed him because he won a big poker game last week. They're talking about running out anyone who seems too educated or refined. It's nonsense, but dangerous nonsense. The sheriff wants to make sure you're protected until things calm down." Hannah wrote again. "Why would they threaten the library?" Harrison read the question and met her eyes. His gaze was direct but not unkind. "Because you represent learning and culture, and drunk, grieving men aren't rational. They see you as different, as better than them, and that makes you a target. I'm here to make sure nothing happens to you or this place." Hannah nodded slowly, taking in the information. She wrote, "Where will you stay?" "I'll bed down in the main room if that's acceptable to you. Just need a blanket and a clear piece of floor. I'm a light sleeper. Anyone tries to come through that front door, I'll hear them." Hannah hesitated, then nodded. Having an armed deputy in the library would certainly discourage any trouble. She gestured for him to follow her back into the main room and found him several blankets in the storage closet. Harrison spread them near the circulation desk, positioning himself where he could see both the front door and the entrance to Hannah's quarters. "You should try to sleep, Miss Nichols," he said softly. "I've got watch." Hannah whispered something and Harrison moved closer, tilting his head to hear better. "Thank you," Hannah repeated, her whisper like the rustle of paper. "You're welcome, madam." Harrison settled onto his makeshift bed, and Hannah retreated to her room, leaving the door slightly ajar. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the night. She could hear Harrison moving occasionally, checking the windows, adding wood to the stove. Despite the circumstances, she felt safer than she had all day. There was something solid and reassuring about Harrison James, something that went beyond the badge he wore. Sleep came fitfully. Hannah dozed and woke several times, each time hearing Harrison's quiet movements in the outer room. Once she heard voices outside, men's voices raised in anger or drink or both. She heard Harrison move to the window, heard the subtle sound of his revolver being checked, but the voices passed, and nothing happened. Morning came with pale light filtering through the curtains. Hannah dressed quickly in a simple blue cotton dress and emerged from her room to find Harrison folding the blankets with military precision. He had made coffee on the library's small stove, and the smell filled the space. "Morning, Miss Nichols," he said, offering her a cup. "Quiet night, all things considered. Sheriff will want a report, but I figured we could have some coffee first if that suits you." Hannah accepted the cup gratefully and gestured to the table and chairs near the reading area. They sat, and an awkward silence fell. Harrison seemed comfortable with silence, but Hannah felt the need to communicate. She fetched her writing paper and wrote, "How long have you been a deputy?" Harrison read the question and smiled slightly. "About 3 weeks. I was a ranch foreman up near Elko, but the ranch got sold to a big outfit from California. They brought in their own men. I was riding through White Pine when I saw the sheriff had posted for a deputy. Seemed like fate," Hannah wrote. "I am sorry about the ranch. No need to be. Things change. A man adapts or he drowns." Harrison sipped his coffee. "What about you? How did you become a librarian?" Hannah wrote for several minutes, explaining about the fever, about her voice, about how the library had become her sanctuary and her purpose. Harrison read everything carefully, his expression thoughtful. "That must have been hard," he said when he finished reading. "Losing your voice like that. But it seems like you've built something good here. This library is impressive for a town this size." Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise. She wrote, "Books have always been my first love. Teaching others to love them too gives me purpose. I can understand that. I've always been partial to books myself, though I've never had much time for reading. Working ranches keeps a man busy from dawn to dark." They talked, or rather Harrison talked and Hannah wrote, for nearly an hour. She learned that he was from a small town in Texas, that his parents had died when he was young, that he had been working ranches since he was 14. He had never married, never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. There was a loneliness in him that Hannah recognized because she felt it in herself. Eventually, Harrison said he needed to report to the sheriff. "I'll be back this evening if the sheriff thinks it's still necessary. Keep the doors locked during the day. If anyone gives you trouble, send someone for me or the sheriff." After he left, Hannah unlocked the front door and put out the sign indicating the library was open. She half expected no one to come given the previous day's events, but she was wrong. The library filled steadily throughout the morning with people seeking news, comfort, and distraction. Hannah moved among them, her whisper forcing people to lean close and listen carefully. Mrs. Peterson came in with her 3 children, all under the age of 10. Old Mr. Crawford browsed the history section, as he did every Tuesday. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the boarding house, returned a novel and checked out another. Each person asked about the murder, about the threats, about what would happen next. Hannah could offer no answers beyond what little she knew. But she could offer books, quiet, and a refuge from fear. Harrison returned that evening, again using the back door. He brought food with him, fresh bread and roasted chicken from the hotel restaurant. "Figured you might not have had time to cook," he explained. They ate together at the reading table, and afterward, Harrison helped Hannah shelve returned books. He handled them carefully, reading the spines with interest. When he came to a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, he paused. "I read some of his poems once in an old newspaper. Didn't understand half of it, but the parts I did understand struck me as true." Hannah felt her heart lift. She pulled the book from his hands and opened it to one of her favorite poems, pointing to the lines. Harrison read aloud, his voice low and measured. "I am large, I contain multitudes." She whispered something, and Harrison leaned closer, so close she could smell leather and coffee and something uniquely him. "It means we are all more than we seem," Hannah repeated in her damaged whisper. Harrison was very still, his eyes on her face. "Say that again. It means we are all more than we seem." "No, I heard what you said. I mean, say something else. Anything." Hannah felt her pulse quicken. No one had ever asked her to keep talking just to hear her voice. Most people seemed relieved when she stopped trying to speak and switched to writing. She whispered, "What would you like me to say?" Harrison did not move back. If anything, he leaned slightly closer. "Whatever you want. I just realized I like the sound of your voice. It's like wind through grass or water over stones. It's peaceful." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She whispered, "Most people find it frustrating. They say I should just write everything down." "Most people are fools then." Harrison straightened, seeming to realize how close he had been standing. "I should set up my bedroll, unless the sheriff has called off the watch." Hannah shook her head and wrote quickly. "He sent a message this afternoon. He wants you to stay until they catch who killed his brother." "Then I'm here for the duration. I hope my presence doesn't make you uncomfortable, Miss Nichols." Hannah wrote, "Please call me Hannah. And no, you do not make me uncomfortable. The opposite, actually. I feel safer with you here." Something shifted in Harrison's expression, a warmth that had not been there before. "Then I'm glad to be here, Hannah, and you should call me Harrison, not Deputy James." That night established a pattern that continued for the next week. Harrison would arrive in the evening with food. They would eat together and talk, or rather he would talk and she would whisper or write. And then he would sleep in the main room while she retired to her quarters. But each night, the conversation grew longer and more personal. Hannah learned about Harrison's childhood in Texas, about the brother he had lost to fever, about his dreams of eventually owning his own ranch. Harrison learned about Hannah's family in Ohio, about how she had come to Nevada with her aunt who had since passed away, about her love of teaching children to read. The library became a different place with Harrison in it. He fixed a wobbly shelf that had been bothering Hannah for months. He reinforced the lock on the back door. He even helped organize a reading group for some of the minors who wanted to improve their literacy. His presence legitimized the library for men who might otherwise have seen it as only for women and children. On the 8th night, after they had finished eating and were sitting by the window watching the sun set over the mountains, Harrison said something that changed everything. "I want to hear you forever." Hannah had been whispering something about a book shipment and she stopped mid-sentence, her eyes meeting his. She whispered, "What?" Harrison turned to face her fully. "I said I want to hear you forever. Your voice, quiet as it is, has become my favorite sound, and it's not just your voice. It's you. These past days, getting to know you, seeing how you care for this town through your books and your kindness. Hannah, I think I'm falling in love with you." Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes. She had given up on love years ago, assuming that her damaged voice and her quiet life made her unsuitable for courtship. She whispered, "You hardly know me." "I know enough. I know you're brave and kind. I know you're smart and dedicated. I know that when you smile, really smile, it feels like the sun coming out. I know that listening to you whisper makes me lean close, and leaning close makes me want to be closer still." Harrison reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "I know this is sudden. I know we've only known each other a week, but I've never been one to dance around the truth. I care for you, Hannah, deeply." Hannah's tears spilled over. She pulled her hand free, but only to write on the paper she always kept nearby. Her hand shook as she formed the words, "I care for you too. More than I thought possible in such a short time, but what future could we have? I am tied to this library and you are a deputy. Your life could take you anywhere." Harrison read the note and set it down. "Then I'll stay here. White Pine needs a deputy, and the sheriff has already said he wants to make my position permanent. As for the library, I would never ask you to give it up. I've seen what it means to you and to this town. We'll make it work, Hannah, if you're willing to try." Hannah whispered, "What if my voice bothers you eventually? What if you grow tired of having to lean close just to hear me?" Harrison cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "Then I will lean close for the rest of my life and count myself blessed. I mean what I said. I want to hear you forever. I want to wake up every morning and hear you whisper good morning. I want to come home every evening and hear you tell me about your day. I want to grow old listening to you, Hannah." She whispered, "Kiss me." Harrison smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face, and leaned in. The kiss was soft and careful, a question more than a demand. Hannah answered by pressing closer, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart beating hard and fast, matching her own. When they parted, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes? Will you let me court you properly?" "Yes," Hannah whispered. "Yes, Harrison." The next morning, Harrison went to Sheriff Morrison and told him about his intentions toward Hannah. The sheriff, still grieving his brother but pleased to see some happiness emerge from the dark time, gave his blessing. The investigation into Henry Morrison's death had stalled, with no clear suspects and little evidence. The town was returning to its normal rhythms, though scarred by the violence. Harrison began courting Hannah in full view of White Pine. He would walk her to church on Sundays, his hand resting protectively on her back. He would bring her flowers from Mrs. Chen's garden, with Mrs. Chen's permission, and a few coins for her trouble. He would sit in the library during his off hours, reading or helping Hannah with whatever tasks needed doing. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people were delighted, saying it was about time Hannah found happiness. Others were skeptical, wondering if the rough deputy and the refined librarian were truly suited for each other. But as weeks passed and Harrison's devotion became clear, even the skeptics softened. Hannah bloomed under the attention. She had lived such a careful, quiet life for so long that Harrison's bold affection was like water to a parched plant. She found herself laughing more, smiling more. Her whispers seemed less like a disability and more like a unique gift, something that brought Harrison close and kept him there. 2 months after that first night, Harrison proposed. He did it in the library after closing time, getting down on one knee among the stacks of books that meant so much to Hannah. "I don't have much to offer you," he said. "A deputy's salary is modest. But I promise to love you, protect you, and lean close every single day for the rest of our lives. Will you marry me, Hannah Nichols?" Hannah whispered. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in 1876 at White Pines Methodist Church. The whole town turned out, filling the pews to capacity. Hannah wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself with help from Sarah Mitchell. Harrison wore his Sunday best, his hair freshly cut, his boots polished to a shine. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, silence filled the church. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed Hannah tenderly while the congregation applauded. Hannah whispered, "I love you," and Harrison replied, loud enough for the front pews to hear, "And I want to hear you say that forever." They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a 2-bedroom cottage that Harrison rented from a widow who had moved in with her daughter. It was modest but clean, with a front porch and a small garden plot. Hannah kept her position at the library, and Harrison continued as deputy. Their routines merged and intertwined. Harrison would wake early and make coffee, bringing a cup to Hannah in bed. They would eat breakfast together, talking about the day ahead. Harrison would walk Hannah to the library before heading to the sheriff's office. In the evenings, they would return home together, and Harrison would help Hannah prepare dinner. After eating, they would sit on the porch if weather permitted, or by the fire if it did not. Hannah would whisper stories from her day about the children who came to the library, about the books people requested, about the small dramas of small-town life. Harrison would share what he could about his work, though he was careful not to burden her with the darker aspects of law enforcement. Their intimacy deepened in all ways. Harrison was patient and gentle, always attuned to Hannah's comfort. She marveled at how he made her feel cherished and desired despite her damaged voice. In their bedroom, her whispers became endearments that Harrison seemed to savor, leaning close as always, his attention focused entirely on her. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with snow piling high and temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the pipes. But their little house stayed warm. Harrison proved adept at managing the wood stove and keeping the fires burning. They would spend long evenings reading together, Hannah aloud in her whisper and Harrison in his deeper voice, taking turns with novels and poetry. Spring brought a surprise. Hannah realized she was pregnant. She told Harrison one evening in April, whispering the news as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Harrison's face went through a series of emotions, shock, joy, and something that might have been fear, before settling on pure happiness. "A baby," he said, his voice rough. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Hannah whispered. "Happy doesn't cover it. I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. A baby, Hannah, our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Hannah continued working at the library until she was 7 months along, at which point the town council gently insisted she take time to rest. Sarah Mitchell, who had become a close friend, checked on her daily. Mrs. Peterson brought meals. The town, which had fully embraced the James marriage, rallied around them. Harrison was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He worried about Hannah constantly, fussing over her health, insisting she rest more than she thought necessary. But his concern came from love, and Hannah found it endearing rather than stifling. On a December night in 1877, with snow falling softly outside, Hannah went into labor. Harrison fetched the midwife, Mrs. Douglas, and then paced the front room while Hannah labored in the bedroom. The birth was long but uncomplicated. As dawn broke, a baby's cry filled the house. Harrison rushed into the bedroom to find Hannah exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. Mrs. Douglas smiled and stepped back, giving them privacy. "It's a boy," Hannah whispered. "A healthy, strong boy." Harrison approached the bed as if walking on sacred ground. He looked down at his son, at the tiny red face and the small fists waving in the air, and tears streamed down his weathered face. "He's perfect," Harrison said. "You're perfect. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for him for this." They named him Samuel James after Harrison's lost brother. Samuel had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. He was a good baby, crying only when hungry or tired, sleeping peacefully between feedings. Caring for a newborn while running the library proved challenging once Hannah returned to work when Samuel was 3 months old. But the town helped. Mrs. Peterson would watch Samuel during the day, bringing him to the library when he needed to nurse. Sarah Mitchell made clothes for him. Even Sheriff Morrison, usually gruff and focused on his work, would stop by to awkwardly hold the baby and make faces that sometimes elicited a smile. Harrison was a devoted father. He would wake in the night to walk Samuel when he fussed, humming old cowboy songs in his deep voice. He made toys, a wooden horse and a set of blocks. He would sit with Samuel on his lap during family reading time, letting the baby grasp at the pages while Hannah or Harrison read aloud. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The years passed with the steady turning of seasons. Samuel grew from baby to toddler to young boy. He was bright and curious, loving books as much as his mother did, but also drawn to the outdoors and horses like his father. Hannah whispered stories to him, and he learned to understand her quiet voice without difficulty, his young ears attuned to her particular way of speaking. When Samuel was 4, the town council officially renamed the library the White Pine Community Library and Learning Center, acknowledging Hannah's work in expanding its mission. They allocated more funding, allowing Hannah to hire an assistant and expand the hours. The library became even more central to the town's life, hosting lectures, debates, and community gatherings. Harrison was promoted to head deputy when Sheriff Morrison's first deputy retired. The promotion came with more responsibility, but also more respect. Harrison had proven himself over the years to be fair, competent, and brave when necessary. He had handled disputes, tracked down thieves, and maintained order during the rowdy Saturday nights when the saloons filled with miners flush with pay. The murder of Henry Morrison was never officially solved, though rumors persisted that he had been killed over a gambling debt by someone who had long since left Nevada. Sheriff Morrison eventually made peace with the lack of closure, though the loss of his brother left a permanent sadness in his eyes. When Samuel was 6, Hannah became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder. She was 31 now, not old but not young either. She tired easily and suffered from nausea that lasted well into the 5th month. Harrison insisted she stop working entirely, and the town council granted her leave without hesitation. The baby came early, on a hot July afternoon in 1883. The labor was fast and frightening. Mrs. Douglas worked efficiently, but there were complications. The baby, a girl, was small and struggled to breathe at first. Harrison held Samuel outside while Hannah and Mrs. Douglas worked to save the baby. Hannah, despite her own exhaustion and pain, whispered encouragement to her daughter, willing her to live, and the baby did live. Her breathing steadied, her color improved, and she began to cry, a thin but determined sound. Hannah wept with relief, and when Harrison was allowed back in the room, he wept too. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew in the hills around White Pine. Rose was small but fierce, fighting her way through those first difficult weeks with a determination that impressed even Mrs. Douglas, who had delivered hundreds of babies. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit by her cradle for hours, watching her sleep, telling her about his day in whispers that mimicked his mother's soft voice. Hannah recovered slowly from the birth, her body needing more time to heal than it had with Samuel. But she recovered, and Rose grew stronger every day. The James family was complete. Hannah returned to the library when Rose was 6 months old, bringing the baby with her just as she had with Samuel. Rose would sleep in a basket behind the circulation desk, and when she woke, Hannah would whisper to her, and Rose would quiet, seeming to recognize her mother's voice even in its damaged state. Life continued its steady progression. Samuel started school and proved to be an excellent student, reading well beyond his years. Rose grew into a lively toddler with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. The library expanded again, taking over the building next door when the tailor moved to larger premises. Harrison and Hannah's love deepened with time, seasoned by shared challenges and joys. They had weathered storms together, both literal and figurative. There had been a drought that threatened the town's water supply. There had been an outbreak of influenza that took several lives, though their own family was spared. There had been economic downturns when the silver mines produced less, and people struggled to make ends meet. Through it all, the library remained a constant, and Hannah's whispered voice remained Harrison's favorite sound. He still leaned close every time she spoke, even after 10 years of marriage. He still brought her flowers when he could. He still looked at her with the same wonder he had shown that first night when he had stayed to protect her from angry miners. When Harrison turned 42 and Hannah 36, they had a long conversation about their future. Samuel was 14, bright and ambitious, talking about going to university. Rose was 8, already reading everything she could get her hands on. The house felt both full and empty, their children growing toward independence. "What do you want, Hannah?" Harrison asked one evening as they sat on the porch. "For the rest of our lives, what do you want?" Hannah was quiet for a moment, thinking, then she whispered, "I want this. Exactly this. You, our children, the library, this town. I want to grow old with you, Harrison. I want to watch Samuel and Rose become whoever they are meant to be. I want to keep building the library, keep teaching people to love books. I want to sit on this porch when we are old and gray and still have you lean close to hear me." Harrison took her hand. "Then that is what we will have. I promise you, Hannah James, I will be leaning close to hear you when I am 80 years old and deaf as a post." She laughed, her whispered laughter like wind chimes. "And I promise to keep whispering to you, even when neither of us can remember what we were saying." True to their hopes and plans, the years continued to bless them. Samuel went to the university in California, studying engineering. He wrote long letters home describing his classes and his life in San Francisco. Rose followed her brother's path 6 years later, though she went to a women's college in the East to study literature and languages. With their children gone, Harrison and Hannah had to adjust to life as a couple again. The house felt large and quiet. But they rediscovered the intimacy of their early marriage, the pleasure of uninterrupted conversations and spontaneous decisions. They took trips when Harrison could get away from his duties, visiting Virginia City and Sacramento, and once going all the way to San Francisco to see Samuel. The library became Hannah's magnum opus. By the time she was 45, it housed over 3,000 volumes, a remarkable collection for a town of White Pine size. She had established a fund to help promising students like Samuel and Rose afford university. She had started a literacy program for adults that had taught dozens of people to read and write. The library had become so essential to White Pine that when a fire threatened Main Street in 1891, the Bucket Brigade prioritized saving it above almost everything else. Harrison remained head deputy until he was 50, at which point Sheriff Morrison retired and insisted Harrison take his place. Harrison was reluctant, feeling he lacked the political skills for the job, but Hannah encouraged him. "You are fair and you are kind and you are brave," she whispered. "That is what a sheriff should be." So Harrison became Sheriff James, and he served the role with the same quiet competence he had brought to every other task in his life. He was re-elected 3 times, each time with a larger majority than the last. People trusted him. They knew he would treat them fairly whether they were rich or poor, mine owner or mine worker, man or woman. When Samuel was 26, he married a young woman from San Francisco named Elizabeth, a teacher with a quick mind and a kind heart. They had the wedding in San Francisco, but they came to White Pine for a month afterward so that Elizabeth could meet the town and the town could meet her. Hannah whispered her approval, and Harrison gave his son a long embrace, proud of the man he had become. Rose took longer to settle. She had inherited her mother's love of books and her father's restlessness. She traveled through Europe for 2 years, sending postcards and long letters describing Paris, London, Rome. She worked for a publisher in New York for another 3 years. But eventually, at 28, she returned to White Pine with a man named David Foster, a fellow editor who had fallen in love with Rose's intelligence and independence. They married in White Pine's Methodist Church, the same church where Hannah and Harrison had married 30 years earlier. Hannah was 52 at Rose's wedding. Her dark hair was heavily threaded with gray now, and lines marked her face, but her green eyes remained bright and alert. Harrison was 56, his hair nearly white, his weathered face deeply lined. But he stood straight and strong, and when he looked at Hannah, his eyes held the same devotion they had always held. The grandchildren came in steady succession. Samuel and Elizabeth had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Rose and David had 2 daughters. The James house, which had seemed so empty when the children left, filled again with noise and laughter during visits. Hannah whispered stories to her grandchildren just as she had to her children, and they learned to lean close and listen carefully, just as their parents had done. The library continued to grow. When Hannah was 58, the town built a new, purpose-built library building with funds raised through community donations and a grant from the state. It was a beautiful structure, 2 stories of red brick with tall windows that flooded the interior with light. Hannah walked through it on opening day with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by what the town had created in honor of her work. Harrison retired as sheriff when he was 62, deciding that it was time to let a younger man take over. He stayed active, helping with the town council, working in his garden, spending time with Hannah. They had been married for 38 years, and they had settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long, successful partnership. But they never lost the romance. Harrison still brought Hannah flowers. He still leaned close to hear her whispers. Hannah still looked at him with love and desire. Their children and grandchildren would sometimes witness tender moments, a lingering kiss, a gentle touch, and marvel at their parents' enduring affection. When Harrison was 65 and Hannah 61, they took a long trip, traveling by train to see all the places they had only dreamed of. They went to New York and saw Rose and her family. They went to Boston and visited the collectors who had sent Hannah so many books over the years. They went to Washington, D.C. and walked among the monuments. Everywhere they went, Harrison would lean close to hear Hannah's whispered observations, and people would smile at the elderly couple so obviously in love. They returned to White Pine after 3 months away, glad to be home. The town held a welcome-back celebration at the library, and Hannah stood before the crowd, her whisper amplified by the acoustic design of the new building, and thanked everyone for their support over the decades. Harrison stood beside her, his hand resting on her back, his expression proud. The years continued to pass. Samuel's children grew up and went to university. Rose's daughters became young women. Hannah and Harrison aged, their bodies slowing but their minds remaining sharp. They spent their days in quiet companionship, reading together, tending the garden, entertaining visitors. When Hannah was 68, she had a health scare, a pain in her chest that sent Harrison into a panic. The doctor examined her and declared it to be nothing serious, just the strain of aging. But the incident reminded them both of their mortality. They were not young anymore. Their time together, precious as it had been, would not last forever. They sat on the porch that evening, holding hands and watching the sunset over the mountains. Harrison said, "I am not ready to lose you." Hannah whispered, "And I am not ready to lose you, but we do not have to worry about that today. Today we are both here, both alive, both together." "I want to hear you forever," Harrison said, echoing the words he had said so many years ago. "I still mean that, Hannah. I want every day we have left." "Then you shall have them," Hannah whispered. "Every single day." And they did have those days year after year. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, then their 45th. Their golden anniversary was a grand celebration, with children and grandchildren coming from across the country, with the whole town turning out to honor the couple who had been such a steady presence in White Pine for so long. Hannah was 72 and Harrison 76 when the end came, not for Hannah but for Harrison. He had a stroke on a Tuesday morning while working in the garden. Hannah heard him fall and rushed out to find him collapsed among the tomato plants. She screamed, her damaged voice producing a sound of pure anguish that brought neighbors running. The doctor came quickly, but there was little to be done. Harrison had lost the use of his left side and his speech was slurred. But his eyes were clear, and when he saw Hannah, he smiled. She held his hand, whispering to him, and he squeezed her fingers in response. He lingered for 3 days, in and out of consciousness. The family gathered, Samuel and Rose and their spouses and children, all crowding into the house that had been filled with so much love. Hannah sat by Harrison's bedside constantly, whispering to him, telling him stories, reminding him of their life together. On the 3rd evening, as the sun was setting, Harrison opened his eyes and looked at Hannah. His speech was difficult, but he managed to form the words, "Still want to hear you." Hannah, tears streaming down her face, leaned close and whispered, "I love you, Harrison James. I have loved you from that first night when you came to protect the library. I will love you for the rest of my life and beyond." Harrison smiled, squeezed her hand one final time and closed his eyes. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, his last sensation the sound of Hannah's whispered voice. The funeral was the largest White Pine had ever seen. Harrison had been sheriff, had been a pillar of the community, had been respected and loved. But more than that, he had been half of a love story that the whole town had witnessed and celebrated for 46 years. People came from all over Nevada to pay their respects. Hannah was devastated but dignified. She stood at the graveside, her children on either side of her, and whispered a prayer that the minister repeated for those who could not hear. She placed a rose on the coffin, the same wild rose variety that grew in the hills and that her daughter had been named after. The weeks after the funeral were the hardest of Hannah's life. The house felt empty without Harrison's presence. She would wake expecting to hear him making coffee, only to remember he was gone. She would turn to share something with him, only to find empty space where he should have been. But she endured. She had her children and grandchildren who visited frequently and made sure she was never alone for long. She had the library, which still needed her though she had reduced her hours in recent years. She had the town, which rallied around her just as it had rallied around Harrison all those years ago. Hannah lived for 8 more years after Harrison's death. She remained active and engaged, continuing to run the library, to read to children, to order books and organize events. But everyone could see that a light had gone out of her. She smiled less. Her whispers seemed fainter. She was waiting, they said, waiting to be reunited with the man who had leaned close to hear her for 46 years. On a spring morning in 1930, Hannah Nichols James died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 81. She was found with a book open on her chest, a volume of Walt Whitman's poetry, open to the page with the line that Harrison had read to her so long ago. "I am large, I contain multitudes." The funeral was held on a beautiful May day. The whole town came, young and old, people who remembered Harrison and Hannah from their prime and people who only knew them as the elderly couple who still held hands on the porch. Samuel and Rose spoke, their voices breaking with emotion as they described their parents' love and devotion. The minister spoke of faith and eternal reunion. And at the end, they buried Hannah next to Harrison, their graves side by side under a spreading cottonwood tree. On the shared headstone, beneath their names and dates, were carved the words that Samuel and Rose had chosen. He leaned close. She whispered, "Love eternal." The library in White Pine continued for generations, eventually renamed the Hannah James Memorial Library in her honor. Her collection of books became the foundation for what grew into one of the finest regional libraries in Nevada. Her literacy programs were expanded and formalized. Her legacy of education and compassion lived on. But what people remembered most, what became the story told to children and grandchildren, was the love between the librarian who whispered and the cowboy who leaned close. It became the town's favorite tale, the reminder that true love exists, that it can endure hardship and time, that it can transform lives and communities. Samuel inherited his parents' house and kept it exactly as they had left it, as a memorial to them. Visitors could see the porch where Hannah and Harrison had sat for so many evenings, the kitchen where they had made countless meals together, the bedroom where they had slept side by side for 46 years. The house became a museum of sorts, though it was never formally designated as such. It was simply a place where people could come and feel the presence of a love that had been extraordinary in its ordinariness, remarkable in its steadiness. Rose wrote a book about her parents, published when she was in her 60s. It became a modest bestseller, touching hearts across the country. The story of Hannah and Harrison resonated with people, reminding them that the best love stories are often the quietest ones, built on daily acts of devotion rather than grand gestures. The grandchildren, and eventually the great-grandchildren, carried forward the values that Hannah and Harrison had embodied: education, service, kindness, and enduring love. They became teachers and librarians, sheriffs and community organizers, carrying the James legacy into new generations. And in White Pine, Nevada, on quiet evenings, old-timers would still tell the story of the librarian who whispered and the cowboy who said he wanted to hear her forever. They would tell it with sighs and smiles, with the knowledge that true love, the kind that lasts a lifetime, is the most precious thing in the world. The story always ended the same way, with Hannah and Harrison together at last, reunited in whatever comes after this life, with Harrison finally able to hear Hannah's voice clearly, and Hannah able to speak without difficulty. Their love perfected in eternity, as it had been tested and proven in life. And so the tale of Hannah Nichols and Harrison James became more than just a story. It became a legend, a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstance, to endure time, to transform both individual lives and entire communities. It became White Pine's greatest treasure, more valuable than any silver pulled from the mines, more enduring than any building or institution. It became, quite simply, the truth that gives meaning to all other truths. That love, real and deep and patient, is the force that makes life worth living. That a whisper can be as powerful as a shout when someone takes the time to listen. That leaning close is an act of devotion, repeated daily over a lifetime, that binds two souls together more securely than any vow or ceremony ever could. In the end, Hannah and Harrison's love story was not remarkable because it was dramatic or tragic or unconventional. It was remarkable because it was true, because it lasted, because it grew deeper rather than shallower with time. It was remarkable because it showed what love could be when two people committed themselves wholly to each other, when they chose each other every day for 46 years, when they built a life of quiet joy and steady devotion. And that, the old-timers would say as they finished telling the story, is the real magic of the Wild West, not the gunfights or the gold rushes or the larger-than-life characters, but the ordinary people who found extraordinary love in the midst of building a civilization in the wilderness. People like Hannah, the librarian who whispered, and Harrison, the cowboy who leaned close and meant it when he said he wanted to hear her forever.